Greetings, friends, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. Today's webinar will be focusing on racism, xenophobia in the Caribbean. This is the third regional webinar of a series of 8, which will be taking place until December 2019. Our hope is to learn about the various manifestations and expressions of racism in different parts of the world, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and other forms of racial discrimination. We hope that this exercise will help us identify what are the common threads across the different regions and also help us find opportunities for collaboration to address these issues. Today's webinar has been prepared in collaboration with my two colleagues, Dr. Nikki Ashwood and Reverend Dr. Mikey Roberts. A few words from them before I introduce the moderator.
Hello everyone, I'm Reverend Nikki Ashwood, not doctor, and I am here at the WCC as the Program Executive for the Just Community of Women and Men. I am seconded here from the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. One of the things that is critical in the Caribbean region is that far often the issue of racism is not overtly discussed. Until recently, when we started the conversations anew, there have been waves of conversation about racism, but it is not necessarily something that is often brought in the open because we pride ourselves on being out of many, one. Our conversation today, therefore, invites us to look at all the different nuances of relationships between the different peoples who have visited the shores. I am sure it is going to be a wonderful time. Welcome.
Good morning to all. My name is Mikey Roberts, originally from Antigua. Now working here at the WCC as the Program Executive for Spiritual Life and also in Faith and Order. And it's certainly good to be able to connect with you across the Caribbean region and indeed around the world for those who are participating actively by presenting or by tuning in and listening to the conversation and raising questions later. The issue of racism, as Nikki said, in the Caribbean is one that has many, many faces. And even though we may not look at it necessarily as a black and white issue and probably related more to issues of colorism, I am happy that we are at least seeking to have this conversation. Hopefully that coming out of this conversation, there will also be some very practical and very hopeful ways that we can move forward in the Caribbean region. We are certainly happy to be able to journey with our colleague today. Just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and so in the midst of our Caribbean dialogue, we may go back into a little of our Caribbean dialect every now and again, and that is all well and good. But if we need to change registers, we may also have to do some translation so that those who are later following the webinar may not be able to fully understand all that we would have said, but it's certainly good to be sharing this afternoon.
Thank you very much, both friends. And so our moderator for the webinar today is Reverend Kelly Jolie. She is an itinerant presbyter at the Methodist Church in the Caribbean and the Americas, in the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos Island District, Nassau Circuit of Churches. The floor is yours now, Kelly. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone.
Good morning.
I'm sure we're in for a really interesting discussion. Looking forward to hearing all of the presenters. May we open with a word of prayer? Let us pray. God of justice and peace, lead us with your divine direction in the power and light of the Holy Spirit, to speak your truth, to share your love, and to be a beacon of hope on behalf of all who are oppressed in this region and the world. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Our first three speakers will be His Excellency David Commission, followed by Mrs. Karen Francis, followed by Mrs. Ayana McCalman. I will introduce the speakers each before they speak, and after the first three speakers, there will be a time of question and answers, and we will proceed again with the next three speakers. His Excellency David Commission is Barbados's ambassador to the Caribbean community, CARICOM, and to the Association of Caribbean States. He is also a founder member of the Caribbean Pan-African Network and the Global African Congress, and was an architect and the first director of the Barbados government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. He represented the Caribbean region at the 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda in 1994 and played a key role in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in 2001. He has also represented the diaspora on the African Union's Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. Between 2012 and 2018, Mr. Commission served as a member of Barbados's National Task Force on Reparations. Your Excellency.
Good day, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. Could I ask for a little clarification? Are we still doing the joint 2-minute introduction before getting into the substantive presentations?
You can
okay.
You can go ahead with that.
Yes, okay. Okay, so in terms of an introduction, I would say that the genesis of modern racism or white supremacy is to be found in the Caribbean, the location of the world's first out-and-out slave societies. That history has left a legacy of a skewed, disproportionate white ownership of the major economic assets of our societies. It has also imposed upon us foundational official structures of law, government, state bureaucracy, and high church that are Eurocentric in orientation and that are purveyors of a lingering Eurocentric cultural hegemony that has negative impacts on the self-image and dignity of Blacks. Of course, since the 1950s and the attainment of universal adult suffrage, significant progress has been made in transforming such official structures into entities that foster human development and the dignity of the majority Black people. And yet, the mission has not yet been completed. We still find unacceptably significant manifestations of the negative anti-Black features of our history. This state of affairs requires a multifaceted response, and some of us believe that the reparations campaign that our governments have embarked upon since 2013 gives us a conceptual and a programmatic instrument with which to tackle the problem. And so I'll end here in terms of an introduction, but I think going forward, that reparations campaign is going to be very important.
Thank you. May we invite your full presentation at this time?
My formal presentation? Okay. Well, as I indicated, we were the genesis of modern racism. The first concentration camps were not in 1930s Nazi Germany. In fact, they were right here in the Caribbean. The haciendas of Spanish Hispaniola and the slave plantations of European colonies like Barbados and St. Kitts and Jamaica were in fact the first concentration camps way back in the 16th and 17th centuries. And of course, those slave societies, those out and out slave societies, we are distinguished by the fact that there were societies before that had slavery, but what distinguished the Caribbean colonies was that they were socio-economic formations that were entirely dependent on slavery for all of their operations, their defining features, their means of sustainability. So we got the full blast of white supremacy and its counterpart, Black inferiority. Out of this came an economic system designed to generate super abundant profits on the basis of the super exploitation of Black or African people. The defining features of our history have therefore been white or European inhumanity, barbarity, oppression, exploitation, Black resistance, and Black humanization of the society and culture, the imposition on our society of a skewed white ownership and control of major economic assets, beginning with the land, the foundational and traditional commercial and financial structures, the foundational business structures of the modern economy, and often in partnership with white metropolitan interests. Also, as I indicated, the foundational structures of law, government, bureaucracy, and the high church. And I would say that this led to a competition or a tug of war between the Black creative humane values that are to be found in our native spirituality, in our native music, our native arts, our folklore, our grassroots social institutions, our nation language. I would say that, if you look at our history, these Caribbean societies were humanized by the people from below, because the people from on top were imposing a very inhumane, oppressive, exploitative structure. Of course, as I indicated, since the 1950s and the attainment of universal adult suffrage, much of this has changed. Much progress has been made in transforming official institutions and structures into entities that truly foster human development and the dignity of our non-European people, although it must be said that class factors did intervene to hold back, in many ways, some of the progress that should have been made. It is undeniable, however, that progress has been made, and yet we still find today in the Caribbean, if we look at indicators such as ownership of land, ownership of banks and financial institutions, ownership of merchant houses and control of the import trade, ownership of major assets such as our hotels, we still find that skewed racial configuration in ownership. And we still find alienating and demeaning values and sensibilities being foisted upon the society via high institutions. And so, in the Caribbean, we are still grappling with African people who feel they must engage in skin bleaching, for example, just to give one manifestation of lingering negative psychological effects. As I indicated, since 2013, the governments of the Caribbean community launched a reparations campaign. In my opinion, the reparations campaign constitutes a multifaceted response to the problem. In that campaign, we have been able to concentrate and focus a systematic body of thought and activism that we have designated reparations, or the reparations campaign. Reparations is not only an outwardly directed process where we level demands for compensatory payments in terms of money, but also in terms of developmental programs at the liable governments of Europe and North America. But it's also an inward process where we look inwards at our societies, at the racist elements still within them that need to be corrected, at issues of cultural and psychological damage that still need to be addressed. Reparations helps us, first of all, with a knowledge of our history, to understand our history, to understand that that emancipation process is still incomplete, and that we need to complete it, that we need to examine our societies for all remaining vestiges of anti-Black, anti-African practices and sentiments and remove them, that we must use reparations to produce a just society, both nationally and internationally, that we must repair ourselves, that reparations must be a mass movement, and the self-repair that we do is a prerequisite for generating mass support for the reparations movement, that we must be determined that no one must be left behind, that we all, the Black people of the Caribbean, we came across the Atlantic in the bottom of the hold of a slave ship. We were inserted at the very bottom of a system of impoverishment and exploitation. Some of us have been more fortunate than others and have managed to remove ourselves from the bottommost regions of that system of poverty and powerlessness, but there's still brothers and sisters who are lingering in that slavery-like condition of poverty and powerlessness, and reparations says that we must lift them out of that condition. For me, the model for a reparations campaign could be the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and 80s. We must, first of all, know our story, but then we must tell it to the entire world, and we must ask our allies to join with us in this effort to, as I say, complete the emancipation process. So I think that in terms of dealing with that unfinished anti-racism agenda, I think the reparations campaign gives us a structure around which to mobilize the efforts of our governments, our civil society, our church, our people in general. And maybe that's something we could discuss as we go further into this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Jennifer Martin has joined us, who was allocated to be the third speaker. And so we will place her back at the third spot. Before we continue, I'd like to remind those who are attending and joining to listen to the webinar that you would turn off your webcams and your microphones so that we can have the best internet connection. Please also place questions and comments inside the chat that is open for all to participate in. We had asked the first three speakers to do a brief overview of the topic throughout the Caribbean region. David has done, to some extent, that for us, and I'm sure that Mrs. Karen Francis and Mrs. Jennifer Martin would have also been prepared to give just 1 or 2 minutes between the two of you in terms of the overview before you do your complete presentation. So if we could just have those brief comments from Karen and Jennifer. So perhaps Karen can go first.
First, yes. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
And you are still hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, I am.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. The Caribbean is comprised of descendants of the enslaver, the enslaved, and the indentured, creating a kaleidoscope of colors, cultures, and variations. The story, however, which is often told, is the story of the enslaver. Now, racism in the Jamaican context manifests in a number of ways. It is a legacy of slavery which continues to affect self-esteem with a knock-on effect of impacting relationships and the treatment of others. We find that the interplay of the oppressed and oppressor can result in being cautious about other nationalities. However, as a nation whose motto represents the racial makeup of the people, out of many, one people, where it is possible to see a Jamaican who looks like a Caucasian, Chinese, Indian, the response to the other may not be as overt as would be expected. Nonetheless, race matters tend to be seen in relation to the degree of blackness and the white-skinned appearance. So colorism and shadism feature greatly. Racism doesn't stand on its own, but intersects with a variety of injustices, economic deprivation, social exclusion, and the violation of human rights, for example. Council for World Mission has placed racial justice at the forefront of our work globally, and the Caribbean has participated in a global project to discover the legacies of slavery, at the heart of which is racism. This has included hearings in places which were points in the transatlantic slave trade, and I will speak more about this further on.
Shall I go ahead with a comment? Are you hearing me? Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry we had technical difficulties, so I still trust that you're able to hear me.
Hearing you, Jennifer.
All right, so good morning, everyone. I joined the conversation a bit late, so I hope that my comments will dovetail into what has been said. And I have, is it 1 minute, Kelly? Yeah. All right. So I picked up part of what David was saying. Race matters in the Caribbean, and sometimes we try to talk around it, but it is never far below the surface. Yet in a strange kind of way, we are one of the most racially integrated places on earth. I mean, we live together and we hardly kill off each other because of race. But the battle and the turmoil and the bubbling is almost there. It's always there. And it is impossible to look at the Caribbean and not think, for me at any rate, and not think of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, who said to us, to black people, "Up, ye mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." And he said those and many other words because he was well-traveled in the Caribbean. He used to go on a banana boat and he was well-traveled. And he concluded that in every country that he visited, the black people were at the bottom of the barrel that David was speaking of. And it occurred to him that it could not be anything inherent in the black experience. It had to be something that was systemic. And since it was systemic, he was convinced that it could be challenged and it could be changed. And so he said things to black people like, black women in particular, do not take the kinks out of your hair. Leave your hair natural, but work on the kinks in your brain, because the kinks in the brain have to do with internalized racism. Now, internalized racism affects everybody, every shade, every color, because racism works and feeds on itself. And so the companion points that David was making when he spoke about reparation, he said there are other issues, apart from the financial and such, there are other issues that still have to be ironed out if people are going to come into the fullness of life for which God intended. So if that will serve as an opening comment, I would stop there to say more later.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. At this time, I'll introduce Mrs. Karen Francis, and she will give her full presentation. Mrs. Karen Francis is the Mission Secretary of Council for World Mission Caribbean, a worldwide partnership of churches in mission. She describes her core calling as communicator, a role which has featured throughout her career. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of the West Indies and Master of Theology degree from the University of Edinburgh, both with majors in communication. Her current work involves galvanizing action against life-denying realities such as human trafficking and gender-based violence. A commissioned minister in the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, Karen is married to Norman.
Friends, if I may begin with a story. We're Caribbean people, so we love to tell stories, eh? So if I may be permitted to tell you a story. My reality is that I did not grow up with an awareness of racism. It was a feature of Jamaica's history of colonial slavery, but not my lived reality, if you understand what I mean. When I went to study in Scotland, I became acutely aware that I was Black and very different from the rest of the population. And only so when I noticed everyone staring at me on the bus. Then I realized, oh, I'm the only Black person on the bus. Or when the young boy who bumped into his hand into me accidentally on the crowded street looked up to see who he had bumped into and then proceeded to rub off his hand as if he had touched something dirty. Now, my lack of awareness meant that I could give you an opinion as a Christian, as a woman, or as a Jamaican, but not readily as a Black woman. So there came a point when I became alert to racism, surveyed the Jamaican landscape, and interrogated our race relationships. And here's what I discovered. I know that there was a time when someone of dark complexion would not be able to get a job in the bank. That was in the 50s and the 60s. The former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley's radical leftist policies in the 70s favored Black poor and emboldened the dark complexion. Although not everyone embraced the Rastafarian religion, there was some measure of appreciation of its gospel of resistance by Black Jamaicans to racism. But notwithstanding, racism still exists in Jamaica today. The offspring of slaves and masters were usually lighter in complexion than those whose parents were both slaves. So what resulted was a kind of hierarchy of worthwhileness, or what I call worth whiteness. And so colorism and shadism are features of modern Jamaica manifested in contemporary ways. So today, skin tone still matters. Young women and men in Jamaica, primarily in lower socioeconomic strata, bleach their skin, and His Excellency already mentioned this. I want to go into it a little more. Those of us who decry this practice should note that middle and upper class folks also lighten their skin, although they call it toning. There is also the chemical peel to keep the skin tight. So the uptown folks purchase toners from established names. The poorer folks mix toothpaste with curry powder, milk powder, bleach, and cornmeal. They strip their skin, which exposes them to skin cancer. Why do they do it? People have different motivations. For some, it is economics. They say it is difficult to get jobs when your complexion is dark. For some, it is social. In a television interview, one woman said, the fairer you are, the more likely you are to become successful socially and romantically. I see Reverend Ashwood agree. A Gleaner article entitled Bleaching Their Way to Acceptance reported that people wanted to feel better about themselves. Racism is a legacy of slavery, and among its effects in Jamaica is low self-esteem. Some Jamaicans believing the lighter the skin, the more socially accepted. And this belief is not based on imagination. Skin tone can and often determines how one is treated, promoted, approached. One's address often determines how one is treated as well, and residents of inner city communities speak of police brutality and injustices because they are Black and poor. Human rights are violated and, for the most part, ignored because of the color of the skin and the class of the victim. But double standards apply. Very recently in Jamaica, there was a case of a young man of brown complexion, we call them brownings, opposite Andrew, who committed traffic violation and was given a pass to the consternation of the public. Now that situation was nuanced, but the fact that racism exists convinced many persons that he got that free pass because of the color of his skin. But I want us to consider too that across socioeconomic divisions, there is a desire for a browning as a spouse, a nice brown baby with pretty hair, rather than the Black baby with coarse hair. So the desire for long, straight hair has led to the practice of putting in braids and hair extensions for some. Interestingly, Caucasian tourists lie in the sun trying to change their complexion, while the Black hotel workers who serve them wish they could swap skin color. It is argued that if there was a more equitable society, anyone could pursue opportunity regardless of complexion. So Council for World Mission recognized that while the transatlantic slave trade and the plantation economy have come to an end, the legacies of slavery continue to impact life and living and are manifested in racism. As a global mission organization, we have recognized our complicity in the Atlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Black Africans through our antecedent London Missionary Society, and we did so in the name of God. We benefited directly and indirectly. The treasurer owned 300 slaves in Trelawney, Jamaica. People who contributed to CWM got their riches from slavery. And the missionaries went out to the mission field on slave ships. So CWM decided to address the issue of legacies of slavery with 4 aims: to assess our own story and complicity, to better understand the urgency of achieving racial justice, to find ways to advocate reparation, and to discover anti-imperial models of Christian mission. Through hearings, we listened to and uncovered stories of struggle and suffering And we have taken the decision, because this was not just one-off talk. There have been recommendations. 1, to issue an apology. 2, to pay reparations. And 3, to develop new models of mission. I think I will stop there.
And Mission Secretary of the Caribbean and North America Council Commission, CANACOM, and co-moderator of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, World Council of Churches. She is a career educator with a lifelong interest in matters surrounding equal opportunities. Her work involves dealing with issues of racism. On moving to England from Jamaica, she worked in the areas of multicultural education and anti-racist education. She helped to establish the anti-racist racism awareness curriculum across the colleges of further education in Lee. Perhaps you can help me with that. Okay, thank you. Her unpublished research paper entitled Toward Equality of Opportunity, Racism Awareness Training as One Route continues to have relevance 2 decades after it was written.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Karen and I have some similarities of approach at the start of my brief presentation. So I'll go straight to the autobiography bit. The matter of race, racism, colorism is very much alive, not only in Jamaica, but as we know in the wider Caribbean. I myself, like many of you, have been to many islands, and we know that some of the facts converge. In my own family, it was not possible to escape talk about racism and multiculturalism. It was not possible because my father was a very light complexion, being mixed race himself. So visually, it was in our family. My mother was very dark-skinned, and that made for interesting family situations. The one example I will give is one that will stay with me forever. So I was a small girl, and I went to the supermarket with my parents. My mother was standing in front. We were in a little queue. My mother was standing in front, my father behind, and I, the small child, was being wayward, so I could see what was happening. I was shifting around. And I saw when the teller, who was the complexion of my mother, she stretched behind my mother to take the goods that my father was holding. They didn't have just a trolley, they had various bits. And my mother, who was always a lively lady, she chastised the teller. And my father, who was always a peaceful man, he stood and he was perplexed because he never took this matter of color seriously. But it was so shabby how my mother was treated by a dark-skinned lady in the supermarket. So I've always remembered that. Jump forward a bit. I got very excited when I was 15, 16, 17 about the Black Power movement, because having gone to a high school in Jamaica where many
Jennifer, we lost the sound. Did we lose Jennifer? Seems like we're having some problems. Can anyone hear?
I'm just hearing again now.
Okay, me too.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're having a very difficult time with the internet accessibility here. So I was saying, so I've had my hair natural for more than 40 years. Because once I learned about Black Power, I decided that my act of rebellion would be to not straighten my hair for the rest of my life. So I would not fool myself into thinking that I'm anything but a Black woman, and a proud Black woman too. So I thank God for the Black Power movement. Now, going to England was quite an amazing experience, because there I met Black people from all across the Caribbean. And the book that attracted us, and me in particular, to go to England was a book written by Bernard Coard from Grenada. And they were looking at how the British education system had made Black children educationally subnormal, because the racism that we know here had transferred itself to England. Now, having journeyed in England and returned home at another stage of life, I come back to find out that racism is a feature of Caribbean life. In the island of Jamaica, the motto says, out of many, one people. And all of us, myself included, we refer to that motto and we love it, because really and truly we get along quite well together. For example, nobody much thinks that Bob Marley's father was white. Some people don't even know this fact until they go to the museum. But Bob Marley was very aware of his Blackness, and that is where his whole music has come from, and the music has influenced the world. But the reason I think we try to hold on to out of many one people so dearly to our hearts is that we really and truly wish that life could be like that. But we are not one people. We try to be one people. We appear to be one people. So, for example, in the Caribbean, Carnival is just kind of catching on in Jamaica, but it's been a big thing in Trinidad and other places for a long time. But whereas in Jamaica, dancehall music in some circles is still frowned upon and described as vulgar, when the people from uptown during Carnival time come half naked into the streets, dancing and gyrating, the page 2 of the 2 newspapers are full of those pictures. So whatever a certain type of people will do will be accepted, and whatever Black people will do will not necessarily be so accepted. I give another example to show that racism is alive and well. Recently in the island of Jamaica, we had a very interesting political campaign in Portland, where one candidate was Black with locks and one was of high complexion, as they say. And both of them played the race card in how the whole election was conducted. In the end, the person with a light complexion won. We are not saying she won because she was light, but we are saying that the race card is alive and well. And so those of us who go to church in the Caribbean, those of us who
Are you back with us, Jennifer? All right, I think if everyone can hear me, can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
All right, I think we may have to move on for now. And so this would be a good place to have our first few moments of discussion. If there are any questions or any comments, there have been a lot of interesting issues raised. One thing that pricked my ears was the fact that whether it's coming from the perspective of in Barbados or Jamaica or me listening as a Bahamian, one of the things that is uniting us is our issues, the issues of colorism, the bleaching Also the intersectionality that comes with all of the comments about women and Black women's hair, and is it only about her race, or is it also about the world's beauty standards, when we know there are Black people with straight hair in the world? And is it more important that a woman feels happy about expressing herself, or does she have to stick within certain boundaries in terms of her appearance as a Black woman? And there are many other issues coming out. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I would agree with you, Merlin. I'd agree with you on the color and the gender issue, certainly within the context of Jamaica, whereas it is seen by some as desirable to be a brown complexion in terms of a woman. In the case of a man, the Black man is seen as the ideal. So it's very interesting dynamic there.
Hello? Hello?
You're back. Hi, Jennifer.
Well, I'm hoping somebody can hear me. I've had the most terrible experience with the machine. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. We've opened up the discussion based on the 3 presentations that we've had so far, and persons were just giving comments.
Okay.
Are there any? Yes, you can. You want to wrap up?
Yes, I want to wrap up and need just about one moment to do that. Simply to say that so in our region, racism is experienced by indigenous peoples, Indian, Asian peoples, Chinese people, and really all of the persons, but the manifestations are different, and the perpetrators are really different. But suffice it to say, the issue and the practice of racism continues to be a thorn in the flesh in Jamaica. I would also say, as my second closing comment, and then I have one last one, there is a huge issue in the Caribbean that we sometimes do not talk about as much as we should, and it is a matter of the stateless Haitian people who were born in the Dominican Republic and find themselves stateless. We can open that up if there is time. I would also like to say, because I'm not sure if anybody else has said it, that the World Council of Churches for many, many years has been very interested and very dedicated to the fight against racism. And through the PJP, we have been visiting the wounds. We have been visiting several parts of the world where people are directly affected by racism, and bringing words of comfort and practical contributions to solutions to which people are working. I'm conscious that time is moving, so I would stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask if there's anything based on your work, specifically with CANACOM, that you would like to mention. And we have Karen did work with CWM, and David with CARICOM. And so we're all strategically selected to present based on our work with organizations and the context in which we live and work. And so would any of you like to bring out those areas of your work? And we remind the speakers to come to zone in on your particular work.
I would offer comments simply because
region.
mine might disappear again.
And I think it just did. Hello?
Has been 32 years and has been practical in working with our member churches. CANACOM works through member churches, and typically we work with programs which are initiated by member churches. And for example, for quite a few years now, we continue to work with projects to do with violence against women and poverty and inequality. Now, once you say poverty and inequality, invariably we have to deal with matters of race. And so the projects which we do are basically designed to help people to become more confident and socially aware of their situation, but not only consciousness raising, but we do practical projects to help people to improve their economic situation so that they might rise out of the barrel of poverty in which people find themselves. Quite often would lead to things like bleaching, domestic violence, being unkind to their children. So the projects that the churches are doing and the ones that we support financially through our empowerment grants and through going out into the field and working and doing training programs with them are directly related to letting people understand that they are God's children. Fullness of life is what they were designed for, and that we should work to it. So that is what I would offer at this time. I'm tired of this thing, it's gone again.
All right, Karen and David, any final remarks on this segment?
I wanted to just make a comment following on David's presentation and his reference to the work with reparations of CARICOM. You mentioned that is very important work, and I think we have a lot of work to do to help the communities of the church to understand why we need to be on board with this work. I want to just to add, though, in agreement with you, that a multifaceted approach is needed, because there is something that can be said for economic reparations. There is something to be said for other kinds of reparations that would help people in very tangible ways to go forward. But we have to do a lot of work in terms of helping people to understand self and appreciate the beauty of self.
Could I say that yes, it's so important that we know our history, because when we know our history, we would get a better perspective on our worth as Black people in this Caribbean region. When we know that history of that terrible oppression that we resisted, and as we resisted, we did not lose our humanity. In fact, it is our ancestors that humanized this Caribbean geographical space. But a lot of our people, we don't know that history. So we have bought in, many of our people have bought into this idea that somehow Black people or African people are somehow second rate. So it begins with a correct knowledge of who we are and what our achievements have been. But then we heard several speakers refer to many racist defects in our present day reality. The Reparations Campaign says that we must deal with those defects in an organized way. So for example, part of the CARICOM Reparations Campaign is to set up in every CARICOM country a national commission on reparations. One of the functions of those national commissions should be to critically examine the society and with a view to discerning still existing remnants of anti-Black or anti-African discriminatory or prejudicial practices or sentiments, and having done so, to report to the cabinet to come up with remedial responses. In other words, we all recognize that we still do have a problem. What the Reparations Campaign does is to now give us the infrastructure to investigate and respond to that problem in a multiplicity of ways. And so I think that this is where we have this opportunity to come together. I know the Caribbean Conference of Churches used to be a leader in the Caribbean in addressing these kinds of issues. In more recent times, we have not been hearing as much from the CCC as we had been accustomed to in the 1970s and 80s. But I think that this new emphasis on reparations since 2013 is an opportunity for us to come back together in a much more focused and collaborative way.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our first three speakers. We're going to keep it tight. There's 1 more hour left, and we have 5 speakers. The next 3 speakers will be Mrs. Ayana McCalman, Reverend Annabelle Lala Ramkelawan, and Reverend Deanna de Gravan. And so I will introduce Reverend Lala. She is the immediate past moderator of the Synod of the Presbyterian Church of Trinidad and Tobago. She is the 3rd woman to be ordained as a minister of the Word and Sacrament by the PCTT. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. She is an advocate for the ordination of women and the rightful place of women and youth in the service of the Church. Reverend Lala Ramkelawan has an LTH St. Andrew Theological College, Trinidad and Tobago, a certificate in social work from UE, a master's in theology from Western Theological Seminary, USA. At present, she is writing her final paper for the Doctor of Ministry program at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary in the USA. Reverend Lala.
Hi, morning everyone again.
Good morning.
It's so nice to be with you, and I'm going to share racism in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. First, let me give a little location of Trinidad and Tobago, because when we refer to Trinidad and Tobago, many people don't know. Caribbean people may know. We are just 8 miles or 11 kilometers of Venezuela, and Trinidad and Tobago is what we would consider a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multicultural society. It is a diversity of people, and we would normally refer to Trinidad and Tobago as a melting pot of people thrown together in one kalaloo. Just to give you an idea of the ethnicity of Trinidad and Tobago, our ethnicity is Indo-Trinidadians, 40% of the population, and Afro-Trinidadians, 40% of the population. We have a mixed race of the East Indian population, or Indo-Trinidadian, and the Afro-Trinidadians, which we refer to as a Dogla population. They are 7.5, that group. We also have Europeans, Chinese, Syrians, Lebanese, and Native Amerindians. And recently, you would all know, we had a mass influx of Venezuelans joining the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Being, such a mixed society, but the greater of the population are the Indo-Trinidadian and the Afro-Trinidadian. To me, racism sounds sort of silly. Piggybacking on what David said, we come from a similar history. The Afro-Trinidadian and the Indo-Trinidadian, we have come from a history of slavery, and we have come from a history of indentureship. We have been through, you know, the difficulties of things. We have been freed to some extent, but yet still there is a fight for supremacy among the Afro-Trinidadian and the Indo-Trinidadian. And it totally amazes me when the world sees both the Afro-Trinidadian and the Indo-Trinidadian as black people. We are not whites, we are black. You know, racism in Trinidad, like the rest of the Caribbean, is alive. It's very alive, but in some ways very subtle in Trinidad and Tobago, because the fight and racism is seen among the two major ethnic groups in the country, when all of us are black. I can't conceive it. But like Karen shared and Jennifer shared, I came from the very southernmost part of the island, and I really did not know the racism that existed between the Afro and Indo-Trinidadian. It's when I came to the central part of the island, appointed to serve as a minister, I was in for a rude awakening of the extent to which racialism existed between the Afro-Trinidadian and the Indo-Trinidadian, because the central part of the island is predominantly East Indian in the 90s, and the southern part of the island where I came from was complete maybe 50% of each race. So it was not something I knew firsthand how the battle between the Afro-Trinidadian and Indo-Trinidadian existed. That being said, the two classes where the fight is, it's not white supremacy or racialism, white and black in Trinidad. It's blacks against black because of our ethnicity, Afro-Trinidadian, Indo-Trinidadian, but colorism plays a big part. And I heard Jennifer talk about the colorism, and so too Karen talking about colorism within your context. But within the Trinidad context, colorism plays an important part. If you are a light-skinned Afro-Trinidadian, a light-skinned Indo-Trinidadian, on the scale of things, you are at the top. If you are as dark as I, you are at the bottom. And if you're brown skin, you're at the middle. So, and there is a big fight between that colorism of both of the races, Afro and Indo. But even worse than that, if you are a light-skinned Indo-Trinidadian, you discriminate your dark-skinned Indo-Trinidadian. If you are light-skinned Afro-Trinidadian, you discriminate against your dark-skinned Afro-Trinidadian. Colorism is a big thing within the context of racism in Trinidad and in race against race. The individualism is one of the racism qualities that we find in Trinidad. In that, if you come from a certain community and you are an Afro-Trinidadian, immediately you are seen as a criminal. If you're dark skinned, it makes it even worse. once you see a dark skin Afro-Trinidadian in a place where you think he shouldn't be, that's a criminal. That's a thief. So we have pocketed people due to racism. If they come from communities, we must stay far from you. And particularly if you're Afro-Trinidadian. We also find institutionalized racism. Jennifer mentioned that, you know, there in the early 60s, 70s, 80s, it changed in Trinidad after the Black Power movement. There was certain position of employment dark-skinned people did not get. Whether you were Afro-dark-skinned or Indo-dark-skinned, you were not getting an executive position in the main income revenue earner of Trinidad, the oil industry. You had to be light-skinned. Black Power movement changed that in Trinidad to a great extent. Apart from the employment sector, even in the school system, before everything came under Ministry of Education in Trinidad, you would find that certain schools in particular so-called aristocratic area, dark-skinned people and Afro children would not be accepted in those light-skinned pastor got into those schools, particularly secondary schools. So we have, it is still practiced today, not only had, still practiced today. There are some schools that privately owned. You will find certain ethnic groups will not be accepted into the school. Also, we have cultural racialism in Trinidad. Remember I said that our culture is diverse. It's a lot of people, a lot of cultures that were brought, a lot of cultures were created because of the history of our people. And you would find there is discrimination in it. For example, years ago, an Indo-Trinidadian dare not want to sing calypso. That was not your world. That was the Afro-Trinidadian world. Just as when they had chutney soca, that is an East Indian form of similar calypso singing in Hindi and English, it was felt that the Afro-Trinidadian did not have a place there. It has been changing very slowly, particular with the Douglas race. 50% of Afro-Trinidadian and let's say 50% Indo-Trinidadian, that race of people, we are seeing them now, some East Indian and the Douglas race into the Calypso arena and into the Chutney Soca arena. That's indigenous music to Trinidad and Tobago. But however, it still has a measure of discrimination in the lyrics that are prepared.
Reverend Lala?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you just give us the final minute of your presentation?
All right, sorry for that. For me, the Caribbean has to really work on racism because we come from a common history as a people taken from a homeland and brought here. A new society we created. We have to join together and work together as a Caribbean people to bring that understanding that it is much more than our color, It is much more than the texture of our head. We are God's people and we are equal in every way. Thank you. I'm very sorry if I went over time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. We move to Miss Ayana McCalman. She is a resilient lawyer, a novice artist, and a gifted writer. Ayana was born and raised in the small village of Buxton, Guyana. Ayana has been practicing law for 14 years. During 2006 to 2012, Ayana served as a trustee, or officer of the Council for World Mission, CWM. Serving CWM deepened her understanding of the relationship between faith and justice. During 2013, while working as a CWM missionary to South Africa, Ayana served as an English web writer for the 10th Assembly of the WCC in Busan, Korea. Ayana considers herself to be a global citizen. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Kelly, and good day to everyone, and good morning, especially to colleagues who are watching the webinar right now, as well as probably are going to watch us later. First of all, I want to say thank you to WCC for inviting me to join this very important conversation on racism, xenophobia, and discrimination in the Caribbean. In the brief time that I have, there are a few things I want to talk about. I quickly want to give my own overview in terms of the Caribbean context. Then I want to specifically share some of the experiences in Guyana, and then to wrap up to talk about, I believe, what should be our mission to erase xenophobia, racism, and discrimination, not just in the Caribbean, but in the world. So the Caribbean context, I've listened to the presentations that have gone before, particularly the first three speakers. And I think as Caribbean people, we all agree that the Caribbean as we know it has emerged out of a slave society. And for me, that means that while the slave society is now illegal, what has remained is the slave culture. And that is what has given rise to what we are discussing today, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. For me, there are two key impacts of the slave culture remaining, and that is one, we are still being defined by our enslavers. If we really were to trace the roots of racism, we would recognize that racism and the concept of race is actually an invention. It was an invention to justify the worst forms of depravity in human history. But unfortunately, we are still defining ourselves by those terms. So we are still being classified as Black and as white.
Okay. And here is also.
Pardon me?
Continue, please.
Simply based on our skin tone. Scientifically, our skin tone is determined by melanin. So race in itself is an artificial concept. I think the second thing to note in the Caribbean context is that while we have this history of being a diverse group of people in terms of our race classification and even our cultural identities, we have not yet learned to live together. We have been living alongside each other, but in many of the communities, particularly when I think of the Guyana experience and the Trinidad experience, I actually studied law in Trinidad and lived there. And it was very similar to Guyana in terms of the makeup, the ethnic makeup of the country. But what I observed, my own experience as a Guyanese, as well as observing other Caribbean contexts, is that even though we are diverse, as I said, we have been living alongside each other, but we have not yet really learned as Caribbean people to live together. To me, when we look at racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, it's all rooted in prejudice. And one of my favorite quotes is that prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. That is what it comes down to. It's an emotional commitment to ignorance. There's no scientific basis, there's no legal basis, there's no moral basis for the prejudices that we have. As I said, you know, our skin tone is determined by melanin. the fact that we're discriminating against persons based on where they come from, for example, our Haitian or Venezuelan brothers, that is simply based on artificial borders that we have inherited. And discrimination is often based on characteristics that the person can do nothing about. The person cannot change the fact that they were born with a certain type of hair or born in a certain type of body, whether male or female. So it's simply rooted in ignorance. In terms of the case of Guyana, like all of the other Caribbean islands, as I said, we've been struggling with race and racism since the early 1600s when we became a slave society. And I'm not sure that we were aware of racism before that, given the indigenous communities that were here. Racism has followed us into independence, and in the case of Guyana, we have been left with a history of ethnic divisions, particularly between, as in the case of Trinidad, particularly between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, because of what was engineered by our enslavers, which is essentially they had used slave labor for 400 years and then simply brought in the indentured group to counter what was becoming organized labor by Africans. So in Guyana, we've still been left with that. After independence, of course, we decided that we would input laws against discrimination. So in the case of Guyana, for example, there's in the Constitution, Article 149 specifically says that every person has a right not to be discriminated against, and it characterizes the various forms. We went a step further. We passed the Prevention of Discrimination Act in 1997, which talks about preventing discrimination based on race and other markers, and race, disability, and other markers based on your, in the workplace. Now, while we have those laws, like I said, the fundamental beliefs around white supremacy, white superiority, black inferiority, those ideas, those beliefs have not changed. In Guyana, we've been noticing that our cultural landscape has begun to change as we've had the arrival of our brothers and sisters from Venezuela, as I mentioned, Cuba, Haiti, and Brazil. So the landscape is actually physically changing. You're hearing a lot more Spanish and Portuguese in the streets. Interesting enough, in terms of racism, the primary point of attack in terms of persons arriving into Guyana has been our Haitian brothers and sisters, who in CARICOM have been given and accorded the right to free travel. And for me, a lot of that attack is rooted in racism, particularly racism against Black people and against Haitians because they are Black. It's gone so far that in August, the government of Guyana had to issue a statement on the arrival of Haitians, basically doing their bit to counter a lot of the negative, stereotypical narrative that has been given. I want to wrap up with this. And for me, the problem, what it comes down to, like I said, is prejudice, which is really rooted in ignorance. And even bigger than that is the fact that justice for a long time in our society has gone missing. Justice has gone missing. We are totally not finding her. And I think it is time, as I said before, for us to not simply talk about the problem, identify the problem, but begin to make a concerted effort to erase racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, simply because, as I said, these are all social inventions that are very artificial. They have no scientific, no legal, no moral basis. For me, there are two things that we need to individually commit, collectively commit to do. And that's one, in the Caribbean particularly, we need to begin to teach the truth about world history and Caribbean history, to particularly right the wrongs that has been done against particularly people of African descent that are being completely placed outside of the history of the world and the history of the Caribbean. We still have, even though there have been many attempts to change the textbooks, we're still having, some people still talk about Columbus discovering the Caribbean, discovering the West Indies. And as somebody said, I'm not sure how you discover something when somebody's already living there. And the second thing I'd like to say, I think as churches, as leaders, and as I said, individually and collectively, we need to stop talking justice and to actually do it. Truth, as far as I am coming to understand it and to know it, is the only antidote to ignorance. Racism, xenophobia, and discrimination are the worst forms of ignorance, and the only antidote to that is to teach the truth. Teach the truth about our history, teach the truth about who we are, and like I said, to encourage people individually and collectively to stop talking about justice and to actually do it. So when they see something negative being written in the press or negative attitudes towards our Haitian brother or sister, wherever in the Caribbean they may be, it won't just be a case of silently whispering, in our churches or over the dinner table, but actually actively organizing to protect our brothers and sisters. So I want to stop there, and I will, I can make some other comments later, but thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Ayana. Next, we have Reverend Deanna de Gravan. She is the Secretary of the Administration Committee of CANACOM. She obtained both her Bachelor and Master in Theology at the University of the West Indies, Jamaica. Contextual theology and pastoral psychology are two areas that highly interest her. In 1995, she was ordained to the Ministry of Word and Sacrament in the Reformed Church in Suriname, which marked an historic occasion, being the first Black Surinamese woman to be ordained in her denomination. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, each and everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity given to bring the Surinamese perspective on the topic that is being discussed, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. Reverend Anna and Ayana just spoke about their current location, Trinidad and Guyana.
Deanna, could I just, hello? Yeah. Your webcam, we're not seeing your face. Could you just move back? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. All right. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. You can hear me clearly though?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. As I was saying, Suriname is the only country in South America that is Dutch speaking. And that in itself puts us at a disadvantage with the other Caribbean countries as well, and countries in South America. Being raised as a Dutch person, I wasn't allowed to speak our own language, Surinamese. It's only when I grew up and went to primary and secondary school, I was somewhat allowed to express myself in our own language. So Dutch is the making up of whole the Surinamese society. Dutch is the language that we negotiate, people are being educated in, and up to university, it's all Dutch. So the whole making of Suriname is, as Anna said, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural. We were brought from all over the world together. But first we had the Amerindians, the indigenous people. And then when the Europeans came, as Ayana said, some people still say that Columbus discovered the Caribbean, but when they came, they came with themselves, and then the Africans were brought, and we all know our history of slavery. But then after slavery, indentured laborers were brought to Suriname to work on the plantations. People from India, people from Indonesia, people from China, and as of late, also people from Guyana and Haiti and Brazil, and what we call nowadays the new Chinese are also making part of the whole ethnic makeup of the Surinamese society. So the population of Suriname is very multi-ethnic. And between these different ethnic groups in the past and still today, there is some tension among the different ethnicities. these tensions are often manifest in prejudices, ethnic prejudices. For instance, people would say that blacks, and with black, I would we have to think of the Creoles. They are lazy. Indians are greedy. Japanese are not to be trusted. The Bush Negroes, those are the Maroons, descendants from runaway slaves. They are uneducated. They are criminals. They don't know how to behave in city life because they live far in the interior. And when they come to the city, they don't know how to behave and what have not. So people compare themselves to different ethnicities, and or they will compare themselves to another social group, and they will look at themselves as, I'm inferior in relation to another a social group. And the beauty in this is what I like about Suriname is that there's not one social group that is bigger in quantity or in numbers than the other. So when you look at the percentage, we all come about like 30 in the 30s or 29%. So we live very beside each other, but we don't live with each other, as Ayana just said. We live parallel, but not really mixed together. We are kept in our own different place, as you will turn it. So the government of Suriname, even though they are trying their best to show people on the rest of the world that our country is a melting pot, that in our country people live happily with each other, in truth and in fact that's not true. The politics are enhancing or are trying to keep people apart. When we look at the different political parties are ethnically based. So you won't, the Creole party, there will be some Indians, but the majority of people will be Creole or whatever. So all the different political parties are ethnically based. Political leaders in the past and some folk today, they believe that social contra identification will fade if children of mixed origin are born. If there are enough mixed race marriages or relationships. I call this, I will use a Surinamese term here, intercracy. And crasy in Surinamese is translated in English as being horny. So if somebody from an Indian has sex with a Creole and they have children, then those children will think different of their race. They become like what we call, and Ayana turned it, or Anna, Douglas. So people will say, I'm a Douglas. And those are then what we say the real Surinamese people. They can't say I'm this or that, or people say I'm half Indian or I'm half black or whatever. So in Suriname, the different ethnic groups live together, but not really with each other. They live alongside alongside one another.
Thank you, Reverend Deanna.
Yes?
Can you just wrap up with one last minute, please? I'm sorry to interrupt, but just.
So what I'm saying is that in Suriname, racism is kept intact through politics. It's politics that make people aware that, okay, I belong to that party, so because I'm that party, your ethnicity is brought to the front. People don't look at ideology that what do we have in common? Even though our national anthem says it doesn't matter where your forefathers came from, we as a people have to serve our country. But politics is telling people, if you're black, you belong to that party. If you're Indian, you belong to that party. If you're Japanese, you belong to that party. And even though the current president, Mr. Bouterse, is trying to incorporate all ethnicities in one party, people still, when they go to the poll, they vote not on basis of ideology, but they cast their vote on the basis of their race. So people are still being kept, in boxes, as to speak. I want to close by saying that we can eliminate racism and discrimination from, I think it should come from the grassroots. If we wait on people for politics to bring that, it won't happen. We as people living together, we eat from each other, we intermarry, we share our culture. We as a people have to say, no, it doesn't matter if you're black or white or Indian or Japanese, you're Surinamese, we are one. That's my talk for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Deanna. Thank you. To make sure that we get these last two speakers in with time to discuss, we're going to have a few comments from Reverend Dr. Mikey Roberts from the World Council of Churches, and then we will go straight to our last two presenters and have the open conversation. Mikey? We can't hear you. Hello? No sound from the WCC room.
Okay. The mic is muted, I think.
Okay, let's move on in the meantime. If the presenters, if we can hear each other, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so then let's move on to Reverend Merlin Hyde Riley. She is the president of the Jamaica Council of Churches. She is an ordained minister of the Jamaica Baptist Union and served previously as a congregational pastor. She is currently serving as the Associate General Secretary of the JBU. She has done studies in history, theology, ecumenism, and gender and development studies, and has a particular interest in how intersecting systems of oppression impact vulnerable groups. And just to remind our two remaining speakers of the time limit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the WCC for having me. And I really would like to begin by celebrating this initiative of the World Council of Churches in hosting this webinar, because it's very important in education and in consciousness raising. When I think of Jamaica, for example, I think many persons would think about colorism and classism in Jamaica, but when you mention the word racism, it causes persons to actually stop and think, because very often persons really do not make that connection, the interconnectedness between classism and colorism and so on. So I just want to affirm how helpful this conversation is for those of us engaged in it and those of us who are listening. Since much has already been said in terms of painting the picture of racism in the Caribbean and in Jamaica, I'm actually going to not go into that kind of detail which I had prepared, but just to highlight some of what has been done and some of what is being done in terms of addressing the issue of racism in the Caribbean, and in particular in Jamaica. And I want to start by just saying a little about Rastafari. This is really one of the few social reference points that gives positive reinforcement to Black identity. It is a movement that has been anti-colonial, anti-racist in terms of its ideology, in terms of its consciousness raising. And it has certainly served to inspire confidence in the reality of being Black through the affirmation of the dignity of all and its symbolic confrontation and rejection of empire. And I think there is still much that we can learn today from the ways in which Rastafari confronted racism. We may not necessarily want to adopt the religion if we choose not to, but certainly I believe that there is still a lot that we can learn from Rastafari. Both the church and secular movements alike in Jamaica would have done a lot, I think. There's still much more that we can do in terms of affirming the dignity of every single human being and recognizing there is no room for discrimination. And so in addition to Rastafari, we also can celebrate our Caribbean theology. I think Caribbean theology has been very helpful for the theological enterprise in the Caribbean as we address the issue of racism. Caribbean theology has made room for our own self-expressions in terms of paying attention to our history and to our contextual reality, so that our theology is informed by these things and not necessarily simply from what we get from the outside. And I really think it is important that we again reflect a little more deeply on our theology, because very often this is what informs how we live and move and have our being. And I also would like to mention the development of Pentecostalism in Jamaica, which is a denomination coming out of the grassroots, in which persons have felt that they are able to be themselves and to express who they are and to be able to connect without necessarily having to put on what is imported from the outside. And I think there is a lot, therefore, that we can learn from Pentecostalism, even as we address the question of racism. I also want to remind us of persons such as national hero, the Right Excellent Samuel Sharp, who was a Baptist deacon and a leader of the 1831 uprising, also called the Baptist War. Sam Sharp recognized the racist presumptions and really defended human dignity, famously declaring, "I would rather die in yonder gallows than be a slave." And so today there's actually a lot of research that is taking place on how Sam Sharp's legacy can inform us in addressing the system of racism, which is so prevalent. I'd also like to remind us of the Right Excellent Marcus Mosiah Garvey, another national hero of Jamaica, who really spent his life and the resources that he had raising Black consciousness and affirming and empowering Black people. Today, his philosophies continue to guide us. One of his famous quotes is that the Black skin is not a badge of shame, but rather a glorious symbol of greatness. And certainly, there is a lot that we can continue to learn from his philosophies. And I want to mention work that is being done currently by the Jamaica Baptist Union and the Baptist Union of Great Britain. But we recognize that the sin of racism has been really permitted to live and to breathe within our institutions for decades. And there is really the need for more attention to be paid to racial justice. And so the Jamaica Baptist Union has sought to keep this issue alive and called upon our mission partners, the Baptist Union of Great Britain, some years ago, to issue an apology for their participation in the trade in slaves. And today we are able to celebrate the fact that after much dialogue, after much conversation on their part, after much soul searching and wrestling, that apology was issued to the Jamaica Baptist Union. And it does not end there, but following the delivery of that apology, they are continuing to explore how they can be more multicultural in terms of life within the churches there and in the wider community. And this discussion also continues through what has been dubbed the Sam Sharp project. And you heard me refer to Sam Sharp earlier. And this is a project which has been developed in furtherance of the apology. It is meant to facilitate further research, further reflection on the historical and theological legacy of Sam Sharp and how the values that he embraced in affirming human dignity can find further and greater application. And even as we speak now, the Center for Reparation, led by Professor Vereen Shepherd, located at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, she has been invited and will be traveling to the UK in October to participate in these discussions. And the Oxford University is also engaged in the discussions that we have been having in relation to how we can learn from Sam Sharp in addressing these issues. The issue of reparation was...
Thank you. We just want to ask you to just wrap up your last minute as you continue.
Yes, I am doing just that. So the issue of reparation would have been voiced earlier in the conversation, so I won't go into that in detail, but just to say that we recognize this as an issue for which and in which we all must become involved, because we're really not just talking about monetary compensation, but we're really talking about all the developmental issues that are involved. And finally, I think when we consider how overburdened by debt we are within the Caribbean, within Jamaica, when we consider the fact that Jamaica has one of the starkest income inequalities in the world, it brings home to us how real the issues that we are dealing with are. For these issues of poverty and income inequality cannot be separated from the issue of class and race. And the church, therefore, has a responsibility to consider its advocacy. Thank you.
He is a professional who has worked in administrative positions with the Methodist Church in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the University of the West Indies Open Campus. He is a former Secretary-Treasurer of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Christian Council. Mr. Daniel has a keen interest in social justice matters and issues related to the development of small island states. He has studied in Jamaica and Ireland and is currently reading for a PhD in political science from the Cave-Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, Barbados. Welcome.
Good afternoon to colleagues in Geneva, and it's still morning here in the Caribbean, and thank you very much, Kelly, and good afternoon to UTC colleagues and to those persons who are listening. Much of what I wanted to say have been said, but I just want to congratulate the particular department of the WCC for hosting these regional global seminars or webinars. They are timely, especially in the when we consider that the United Nations has declared, you know, this the decade of the International Decade for People of African Descent, among other things. I simply want to begin with the end, and to say that, and agree with some of our presenters earlier, that the notion or the idea of racism is one that has been imported and imposed and still permeates in subtle ways in these islands, in this region, in various forms, particularly in a more subdued form in our legislations, or some of our legislations. And so I think we have to interrogate the notion of racism, and to critically revisit this idea or this notion of racism. That's one of the first things I like to say. The second thing I want to say as well is to remind us, or to challenge us, to look at one of the more blatant sources of racism or discrimination, if you want to say. It is our inherited our Christian heritage in terms of the Judeo-Christian Bible. I want to say that in itself is a source of discrimination that we often tend to hide under the carpet. I also want to say that we have a political culture in this region that every 5 years or so, sometimes before the 5 years ends, that our politicians, our leaders, play each other off. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, it is perhaps the most starkest. But in a small society like St. Vincent, it is subtle, but it is very evident. So that our political culture, we have to begin to interrogate what we have inherited, and we love it so much that we have not done the kinds of reforms that are necessary to deal with the political culture. That is in itself a source of discrimination. And if you were to check the laws of each of these islands, all of us have signed on to the conventions and the covenants of the United Nations, but we have not expanded or enlarged the freedoms that this intergovernmental body has anticipated for us to do. So I begin with those three things: that we have to interrogate the notion of racism. We have to interrogate the source of much of our theologizing in the Caribbean, and particularly the Bible as a source of our faith and what it says about women and peoples of different shades and color. And I want to give an example of a few years ago, one of my theological mentors and political mentors, the late Oscar Allen, and a group of us started what we called a Bible study series entitled Black People and God. And one of the elders in my home church, Kingston Methodist Church, when we were conversing persons, inviting persons to this Bible study, they wanted to know why such a title, because as far as they were concerned, this racism thing, this Black people thing is something of the past. And we were terribly shocked at that kind of thinking coming from what we consider to have been an elder in our faith community. So I say that to say that we have to really look at the source of our theologizing and what is it that we are saying to our people. To St. Vincent is a small multi-island state. And of course, it has, like most of the English-speaking Caribbean, a history of enslavement, a history of slavery and colonialism. And of course, the ethnic composition of the island, like most of the islands, reflects the pattern and experience of plantation slavery, indentureship in the Eastern or in the Anglophone Caribbean. And so, although St. Vincent enjoys what I will say is a relatively high level of harmonious relations among its peoples and those persons who have made St. Vincent their home, historically, however, this has not always been so. Indeed, like most of the English-speaking Caribbean, St. Vincent inherited from British colonialism a set of institutions through the dominance of the political systems of the old representative system, then Crown Colony, then a form of representative government, which didn't last too long. And so with this, these systems...
Sorry, Ronnie, just to ask you to use your last minute to wrap up.
Sure. Okay, sure. So St. Vincent has, with these institutions, there came many consequences of practices. And so if we recall, one of the cruelest cases in St. Vincent has been the banishment of the indigenous people in 1797 to an island just off coast of mainland St. Vincent called Baliso. About 4,000 of them, but about just over 2,000 were shipped off to Roatan, just off the coast of Honduras in Central America. That is a result of a policy, a very discriminatory policy at the extreme end of British colonialism. But there are other subtle forms. Our political culture, which we have inherited, which we love so much, we have not, in my humble opinion, we have not done the work, the necessary reforms to ensure that we lift our people. And every 5 years, we see the implication of this political culture. I want to throw in the mix that as well, because at the end of the day, it is that activity that reinforces, that encourages each sector of our sections of our populations to play off against each other. And so it wasn't a surprise in 2015 when one person made the remark that there are too many Black young people following the Unity Labour Party, which happens to be the political party that Dr. Gonsalves, who is of Portuguese ancestry, he leads that party. Quickly, I just want to say that the modern expressions of racism and discrimination are clear in St. Vincent. You may not see in your day-to-day activities, but after the 2010 elections, 3 teachers who ran on the opposition ticket weren't able to return to their duties as teachers because the constitution was manipulated, and therefore the 3 teachers were not able to return to their work because of a manipulation of our constitution. I say that to say that enshrined in all the constitutions of all these islands is the certain prohibitions on in our constitutions found in chapter 13. But the concern is that while we have signed on to all these conventions and covenants, they are not reflected in an enhanced constitution and some of our legislative instruments. There's a question of the state of women and leadership, and particularly St. Vincent has a very high rate of incidents of rape, particularly our girls and our women. And those are some of the issues that we could consider to be discriminatory, although we have relatively recent laws and up-to-date laws. The challenge for us is that we do not have an instrument that sufficiently gives the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines some of these fuller rights as enshrined in the international conventions and covenants.
Right.
I want to stop here.
Ronnie, thank you so much for your presentation. We really have to stop. We're going to have to go over a few minutes because we really want to have some feedback, and there are also visitors in the conversation who are just listening at this time, who may have brief comments. And so at this time, before we allow those brief comments, we would go back to Mikey in the WCC room in Geneva. Hopefully they have unmuted themselves.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm just going to say one thing. The Caribbean Conference of Churches has to be revised and revived.
Amen.
Then, rather than a 2-hour conversation, it will be 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months,
this conversation,
so that this becomes not just a webinar event, but grassroots conversations happening in Guyana, in St. Vincent, in Jamaica, in Trinidad. So this, we just have to engaging in CARICOM, engaging with conversations through, CW, just all, because even as we listened to David at the beginning, politicians will always be politicians. And it is all about getting re-elected. And in spite of CARICOM's efforts to have repatriation and all of these committees, at the end of the day, the politician's goal is to get back in office. Some pastors may refuse to deal with some things because they may also be afraid of being called into an office of a superintendent and being told you are out of place. So I think as I've listened to all of the discussion, and there are so many valuable things that have been said, it simply underscores the need for the Caribbean ecumenical movement that was really being advanced through the vehicle of the Caribbean Conference of Churches really needs a boost so that these matters can again become not just talking points, but as was said before by Deanna, we go from talking to moving, to seek justice.
I wonder if I may just say something in response to that very quickly. May I?
Go ahead.
I agree with the last part of your comment, Michael. There is need for the Caribbean ecumenical space to be re-energized and revitalized. And Merlin was a part of a conversation recently with CWM about that. I'm not sure if it's the Caribbean Conference of Churches. I think it is time for us to stop and think what is needful at this time. And just to ensure that we do have the Caribbean conversation happening towards a movement. And I shared in the notes that the World Mission has plans next year to initiate that kind of conversation for us to move forward.
Thank you.
Totally
We
agree.
have.
Totally agree.
Thank
because
you.
we don't, in terms of our ecumenical movement, to be like the politicians do.
We have heard much about the need for unity. One thing I would like to invite in the responses, even in terms of our guests, this is a church body. We represent various churches right here. We have presented Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, and CCA, Methodist United Church. There was talk of the Pentecostal Church. We've heard about continued shadism, racism, discrimination. We know that in our churches, the members, for the most part, for example, in Jamaica, they do not like the idea of using the Patois Bible, right? The Patois language in worship. They do not like to stray away from the King James Version of the Bible. We heard it, I mentioned that because we heard it mentioned of the Bible as a tool or a source of discrimination, and our church roots as we have them being part of colonialism. And so how do we now, in this day and age, how do we turn our talk into justice work as church? And so I would like us to reflect on that question, as well as we have already a comment in the chat section from John Derry. And John Derry, I would like you to turn on your microphone so that you can speak to us and tell us where you are from and which church you are representing, as well as your brief comments, please, if you can hear me.
Yeah, I do. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. We'll mute our microphones so we can hear you better.
Yeah, I'm Joe. I'm Joe Derry, and Can I speak?
Can we mute the other microphones? John Derry, go ahead.
Kelly, perhaps it's wise for you to read. Gets him on.
Got you.
Go for it now, John.
He's coming through us.
Yeah. If you want, Kelly, can you read my comment?
Yes, it's better.
Okay.
Yes, I'm going to read your comment. John Derry, he is in Haiti, the Catholic Church, and he says, I probably understand Ayana's presentation about racism on Haitian people in the Caribbean. However, it is not only that. There is a stereotype about what is meant to be Haitian. For example, in the Dominican Republic, if a Haitian is well dressed and speaks well, they will say it is not a Haitian. So being Haitian means poor and dirty. The reality of the country also contributes to the mistreatment regarding the Haitians. And that's John Derry's comment.
I think I would want to extend that to say that there is a school of thought that argues that part of the challenge with Haiti in the eyes of the international community, which has therefore been absorbed by the Caribbean, is that how dare Haiti and Haitians, a black nation, wrest their independence from the white plantation overlords. And while the school of thought may be wrong, one gets the sense that it is as though there is a conspiracy of oppression to keep the Haitians down. So much so that the religious political talk, whenever there is a disaster in Haiti, and yes, extended to other spaces, is this is upon them because God doesn't like the voodoo and the witchcraft. And that has even been perpetuated, Kelly, in the recent Abaco floods in the Bahamas, where we are hearing that it is prophesied about the Haitians who were perpetuating their acts of necromancy and witchcraft. But there is also this sense of statelessness that is perpetuated, where it is almost the worst place to be from anywhere in the world. It would be equivalent to the Jamaican Bakamoko. And I think as a region, we need to decide how it is that we are going to treat with the Haitian situation to restore the dignity of a peoples who were resilient enough to say no to Bakramasa.
Yes, very good point.
Kelly?
And I think what you said alluded to the fact that a lot of our theologies that we carry with us as Black people, as said before, it links with the deficiencies in our cultural ideas about ourselves. And so our messed up theology also allows for the space to say, because those people over there are doing such and such, or because I don't understand them, then God doesn't love them, or God is going to lash out with them, lash out at them. Somebody was trying to speak.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. I just wish, first of all, to thank Jean for his comment. And I think the Haiti question actually addresses a comment that Lydia is making as well about decolonization of the Bible. As I said earlier, truth is the antidote to ignorance. And a lot of our Caribbean brothers and sisters don't know the true history of Haiti. As Nicole said, Haiti is the first Black republic. More than that, Haiti, at the time of its independence, in excess of 200 years ago, also was one of the first states to actually invite both people. And what is unfortunate is that Haitians have now become both people. So once you had gotten to the island of Haiti, you were granted independence, no matter your status, or how you would have looked or where you would have come from. So I think it's this sense with which we have to know our history, because knowing that history and actually visiting Haiti has made me understand that we definitely need to show compassion to our Haitian brothers and sisters, because they have led the way for all of our independence stories. That's number one. And I think quickly on the voodoo. Now here again, it's this narrative of anything that is associated with Black spirituality is demonized. And we have to accept the truth as persons coming from the Christian tradition that Christianity has actually encouraged that. So part of the reversing it is also to get to a place of truth telling about that portion of Christian history, and the fact that in many instances our churches are not encouraged, not allowed, in the way ministers are trained, in the way they are taught, in the ideologies and the theologies they are taught. They are actually taught to discount any form, particularly of Black indigenous spirituality. And if we're going to really talk about liberating Haiti, liberating people of color throughout the Caribbean, we will have to address that question as well. But it will be a difficult one for churches, because it means actually acknowledging, like I said, the truth that the Bible has been used to discount African spirituality, to negate it, to demonize it, to determine it as witchcraft and less worthy than the theology that we've been given. So it's not just a question of Haiti. It's that spirituality question is a question that needs to be addressed across the region, because a lot of what we believe about ourselves and about others and about our history is also rooted in those ideologies that we're being taught from the pulpit and that we're receiving every Sunday for years of our lives.
If I may,
just the comments in the comment section. Just Lydia. She says, I think there's an opportunity to explore and engage in new theologies that help to decolonize our traditional interpretation of the Bible. We'll take David.
Yes, if I may. We need to know our story. We need to know the truth about ourselves. Even in relation to Haiti, the people who organize evil campaigns of genocide in Haiti were not the practitioners of voodoo. It was actually the practitioners of Roman Catholicism that organized genocidal campaigns against the practitioners of voodoo. So, and that's, I mean, that's just the history of Haiti in the 20th century. So if you're looking for organized evil in Haiti, it's not voodoo. It comes from the established Christian church and the hierarchy and the elite that supported that supports that hierarchy. But I want to caution us that even while we point out deficiencies in our society, we must be conscious of the fact that perhaps there are no people on the face of this earth that have done more to rescue and uphold the dignity of Black people than we Caribbean people, our independent Caribbean nations, all across the Caribbean. If you look at what we did when Black people finally, with universal adult suffrage, were able to get their hands on the governments of our territories and use that governmental power for the first time to uplift the masses of our people. So yes, there are many ways in which we are still deficient, but let us not discount the tremendous work that we have done for ourselves. And even to speak about theology, let's not discount the tremendous work that the Caribbean Conference of Churches has done. Let's not discount the tremendous work we have done, scholars like Professor Hilary Beckles, Tony Martin, in researching and writing our history. So the point I'm making is, while we justifiably look at where we are failing, let us not do a disservice to ourselves by underestimating the extent to which we as a Black people in this Caribbean have risen to the challenge of defending and upholding Black dignity. And if we know our history, we will know that virtually everything that is creative and humane and decent about these Caribbean countries, that has been the contribution of the folk from below, the Black people, the Afro-Indian people, not the hierarchies from above, because all these countries were only intended to be very exploitative island factories generating profits for Europe. Extremely humane, extremely oppressive. We humanize these spaces. We still have work to do, but let us not fail to give ourselves credit where credit is due.
Imo Yango from the United Church of Canada wrote in the comment section, "It is true that colorism or shadism is rooted in colonialism. The space it is occupying now, however, in what is supposed to be a post-colonial context, is rooted in what we can term as colonial mentality. It's a demon that follows every colonized individual. One can say it's the psychological residue that the hegemonic empire left in our DNA. For this reason, we need to keep vigil that the process of decolonization among colonized peoples and our respective cultural institutions is an ongoing process. This colonial mentality has reared its ugly head even in our theologies." And Michael Blair, as a follow-up to all of this and Lydia's question, what does the reality of our decolonization look like in the Caribbean? David mentioned the not putting aside the signs of hope or the organizations, institutions, and individuals who are working to change the status quo, and not to toot our own horn per se, but we can also remember that the Methodist Church in the Caribbean and the Americas is the one, if not the only, it is one of the only churches that operates similarly to CARICOM, where you have 8 districts within the Caribbean. Could someone in the background mute their mic? Where we have 8 districts throughout the Caribbean, from Bahamas in the north and Guyana in the south, where our ministers, such as myself, are itinerant and are sent to live and work and minister in these different territories, which is maybe one small way that we foster that that oneness that we have spoken about before, that is lacking, even though we live together. The oneness that still needs to be fostered. A last question: where is the hope? Where is hope? And we want to color this. Let's talk more about in the church. What are we doing? What do we do? Where is the hope? What is the work that can be done?
I would like to make a comment. Hello, Kelly.
Yes, Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh yes, I wasn't there. Yes, I think there is cause for hope. Canacom has member churches, and so I have a slightly wider reach than just one church. And I'd like to speak briefly on the Haitian question. For many years, Canacom has been very concerned about the situation with the Haitians, particularly in the Dominican Republic. And we have a member church in the Dominican Republic. And one gets the feeling that there is a certain degree of timidity in approaching the question with the government, because sometimes to approach questions of oppression with government can cause people to come into head-on collision. But what we have done through our member church and through another agency, Canacom has given some money towards helping persons to pay the fees to get their nationality regularized. Now, it is a small example, but a helpful examples of what can we do for persons who find themselves outside of the bounds of citizenship. And also that member church has done projects with providing supplies for mothers and babies who are born in the Dominican Republic. Canacom also has started the conversation through the JCC, but also the Presbyterian Church in Trinidad and Tobago. We have started the conversation again with the CCC, because we, along with many others, are very concerned that really we should not be ending next year without the CCC coming to life again. So the member churches, to kind of summarize, are doing many small projects: after school care, working with mothers and children, giving people life skills, helping persons to find employment, hurricane, the disaster relief, and so on. There is hope in the church, but there is continued scope. And I think when David was speaking and saying we're not to shortchange ourselves in recognizing what we have done. We do recognize what we have done, but every time I hear Peter Tosh's hymn, Creation, Jah is my keeper, I recognize that, yes, we are holding on to God, to Jah as our keeper. But there are many persons who are living in our region below the poverty line, below the line of hope. So every small project upon which we embark is help. But we need to come together in a more solid way and a more collaborative way, so that we can be instantly recognizing what we are doing and see where the weaknesses still exist. Thank you
so much, Jennifer. Could we ask Annabelle, your comments as we wrap up? 1 minute, the sign of hope with the PCT work in Venezuela. Just a minute, please.
PCT's work with the Venezuelans started even before they began coming over to Trinidad. We started a project in the deep southern part of the island, which is closest to Venezuela, in providing grocery supplies, coming into that citrus area, looking to purchase items of food. So we started somewhat of having food available at the church we had there. We also had a project where we had laid the someone in Venezuela, and we were sending supplies for babies, milk for babies, pampers for babies.
Thank
now,
you.
Now, right, what we are trying to do is seek to get the Ministry of Education to work with us to have the children gain entrance into the Presbyterian elementary schools and secondary schools for educational purposes. And we have launched some centers where we are teaching English to the Venezuelan migrants.
Kelly, if I may, I have a quick question, if it's allowed.
Thank you. We were just going to ask you. Wait, Ronnie. We were just going to ask you to, to respond briefly based on all that has been said about your context.
Well, no, I just wanted to quickly ask David a question about the CARICOM strategy, because I know on the reparation issue, for example, I know there's a committee here in St. Vincent, but there appears to be no real engagement with civil society. I know they've gone into schools and so on, but particularly I still think the church has a very captive voice in these islands. And I am not aware, except for Jamaica. I know Jamaica is far ahead in terms of the work. So I just want to find out what is the strategy.
Yes, let me just ask David to briefly respond to that.
Yes, you're quite right that the campaign was started. The campaign was started in 2013.
Yes.
But in many respects, we still have not put all the pieces together properly. The Prime Minister, newly appointed Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, she now takes over leadership of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, and will have to give the work of the Reparations Campaign guidance and structure going forward. But I take the point that we have a lot of work to do in putting the infrastructure properly in place, having the national committees very clear about what their role is, and about how they should be reaching out to civil society and to the churches. When I was on the Barbados Task Force, our national committee, we met with the executive of the Barbados Christian Council, about 30 church persons. And I could tell when we first came into that room, the doubt and skepticism that was on the countenance of the church persons, probably thinking that reparations was just some kind of vulgar money grab. But by the time we had reasoned and we had explained what reparations truly was, about the self-repair and the validation of our humanity and all the rest of it, these church persons were asking for additional information. They had had a new understanding of what this reparations idea is. So I would like to begin where I started. I think that the reparations idea, properly understood in its holisticness, is an extremely powerful mechanism for us to coalesce around, to do this work of repair and redeeming our societies. And the church, the Caribbean church, in many respects, led this work way back in the early 1970s. The Caribbean Conference of Churches, a lot of what we are now trying to do in reparations, the Caribbean church prefigured. And we have to ask why the CCC has declined. But I think this is a new opportunity, really, for us to be re-energized and come back together around this kind of campaign of repair and redemption.
David, thank you. Thank you so much. We really have to stop there. We're going to wrap up, but I would like to read these comments. There were more comments from persons following the discussion earlier. Reverend Deanna And there are some questions that I would say are left for our reflection. Reverend Deanna Boissier, the Caribbean communities in the US mirror much of the colorism, cultural racism, and discrimination that was discussed by the panelists. What suggestions do you have for how we can practically embrace the Caribbean theology that was mentioned and address the demonizing Afro-Indigenous religious traditions in our worship? Address the issue of people demonizing Afro-Indigenous religious traditions. John Derry was the one who left the comment earlier about Haiti, and he responds again. Sir David, it is true that those who make large discriminations about voodoo are those from the Catholic and Protestants, but it is based on the fear that people who practice voodoo are killing others, not in large groups, but one by one. Ayana McCalman, Reverend Deanna, we need to begin by teaching within our faith spaces the truth about African spirituality. People are predisposed to fear what they do not understand. Sean Derry, also voodoo was always seen as bad from the beginning of colonialism. Christians' heritage, the idea that voodoo was bad from the French and Spanish people. One last comment from Deanna Boissier. We must honestly and with integrity address the infighting of supremacy that still exists within the Caribbean communities in both the islands and in the States. And I question what are the practical steps that we must do to revitalize the Caribbean Council of Churches, as was said before. And so at this time, we have to complete this lively and provocative webinar. Thank you so much to the presentations by all of our presenters around the Caribbean. I believe you have done us justice. And I turn over to the Geneva room.
Thank you all so very much. I am proud of you all. You have done us well, you have done us proud. And I agree with you, Sir David, that we need to lift up and embrace the elements of hope. I hear Ayana reminding us of where Black has been beautiful. I hear Annabelle's conversation about us all being Black at the end of the day and needing to address those issues. It is a political issue, as you say, Ronnie, and we all use the political lens in different ways, especially in church. What I would say as my last word is this. Evidently, we have only just begun to go near the tip of the iceberg. This conversation must continue, and I challenge all 9 of you to keep the conversation going. Aluta continua. Hats off.
Thank you.
For me, again, thanks to all of you for your contributions today. As Nikki and I sit here in Geneva, we are certainly proud to be 2 persons from the Caribbean who are able to sit around this table and to look and to say our region is still very much at the table and engaging in the issue. And I want to challenge all of us not just to be optimistic, not just to have optimism, but to move beyond optimism and to really hold on to hope. And hope in Christ is a good hope. In fact, it is the best hope to have. And so with that, I invite us all to continue to hold fast to that hope. That conversation and the next conversation will certainly lead not just to another conversation, but eventually to action. Thank you again.
So the last words I think come to me. Thank you so much to each and every insightful presentations, the depth of conversations. For those of you who don't know me well, from Ethiopia originally, and the Caribbean is very close to my heart for many reasons, so I've learned so much from each one of you today. As Nikki and Mikey have said, this is just the beginning of a conversation. We're trying to highlight different manifestations and expressions of racism in different regions. And this is the 3rd of a series of 8 webinars, regional webinars that we're organizing. And this has been by far one of the most interesting because we are 30 minutes beyond time, but I think it was just worth it. And it will be recorded, and the recording will be shared to many who have not been able to join, because I get a lot of feedback from the recordings as well. You might be happy to know that in addition to Caribbean and North America, we have participants from Cameroon and Egypt with us. And I know that others are very interested in this conversation, and we hope that this is just the beginning of a process. So next webinar, I invite you all to join us again, and it will be in 3 weeks, 21st of October, and it will be focusing on the African context. So I hope you will join us and spread the word as well in your network. Thank you so much again, and see you soon. Let's stay connected, and as pilgrims of justice and peace, let's continue to work for racial justice. Thank you very much.
Amen.
As I close us off in prayer, we would always let Segma know for the Caribbean, we don't have 1 hour churches. We do go a little longer.
A little longer, yes.
I like that. We do the same in my continent.
You know, and there will be the church after the church. So.
Yeah. I'm an Orthodox, I can relate to that. So.
But let us pray. God, we are thankful that as your people, you have called us to serve in your world. We are thankful for this call that you have placed on our lives. And we ask for the Holy Spirit to anoint and to fill us again so that we will serve you faithfully. And as we serve you, may we continue to be a light in a world that needs to know the gospel of Jesus Christ is one that still declares Christ saves. Give us all hope so that we believe that tomorrow will not only be a new day, but a better day. And now may the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be upon us and remain with us and all God's people everywhere. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you very much.
Peace.
Peace.